when someone pulls away, most people don't pause to analyze what is happening. They react. They chase. They text more. They explain more. They try to earn clarity. But here is the behavioral truth. When you increase pursuit in response to withdrawal, you are not creating connection, you are reinforcing distance. Avoidant individuals are not simply hard to get. They are wired to experience emotional closeness as pressure. So every time you move closer without stability, their nervous system reads it as a signal to step back further. Now here is where the cycle becomes dangerous. Because the more inconsistent they become, the more your brain starts to fixate. Dopamine doesn't respond to love, it responds to uncertainty. Intermittent reinforcement is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You are not just liking someone. You are getting conditioned. And once that loop is active, your behavior stops being intentional. It becomes reactive. You begin chasing not because it works, but because your nervous system has been trained to crave resolution. This is where the shift happens. The moment you say, let them pull away. Let them misunderstand you. Let them choose distance. Not as punishment, but as interruption. Because let them is not passive. It is a control mechanism. It stops the behavioral loop between anxiety and pursuit. It creates space for your nervous system to reset. Now, something important happens when you stop chasing. At first, discomfort rises. That is withdrawal from emotional dependency. But if you stay still, something else emerges. Clarity. You begin to see the dynamic without emotional distortion. You realize something critical. A stable connection does not require pursuit. You don't have to convince, explain, or overextend for reciprocity. Real connection meets you in consistency, not confusion. And here is the transformation point. When you stop chasing avoidance, you are not losing them, you are recovering yourself. This is where leveling up begins. You redirect energy that was previously spent on uncertainty and invest it into structure. Your body, your discipline, your purpose, your skill set, your environment. Because attraction is not built through pursuit, it is built through presence, groundedness, and self-regulation. The person who can sit in discomfort without reacting is no longer controlled by emotional triggers. That person becomes stable, predictable, internally anchored. And ironically, that is what creates real relational power, not chasing, but containment. Not pursuit, but direction. Chasing someone who is emotionally inconsistent or distant doesn't create closeness, it creates resistance. This is a fundamental behavioral response rooted in human psychology. When one person increases pursuit while the other is pulling away, the nervous system on the receiving end begins to interpret that pursuit not as love or connection, but as pressure, and pressure, in emotional terms, often activates the need for space. The more you try to close the gap through repeated messages, explanations, reassurance, or emotional effort, the more the other person's internal system registers a loss of autonomy. Even if they initially had interest, that sense of being pursued too strongly can shift their perception from curiosity to discomfort. And once discomfort is introduced, withdrawal becomes their primary coping mechanism. What most people don't realize is that this dynamic is not purely about the other person, it also changes your internal state. As you begin to chase, your focus narrows. You start monitoring responses, timing, tone, and emotional availability. Your attention shifts away from your own stability and becomes anchored to their behavior. This creates a feedback loop where their distance increases your anxiety, and your anxiety increases your pursuit. From a psychological standpoint, this is where resistance forms. Resistance is not always conscious ejection. It is often a subconscious protective response to perceived emotional pressure. The more intense or frequent the pursuit becomes, the more the other person's system prioritizes self-protection over connection. Instead of moving toward you, they instinctively move away to restore emotional equilibrium. At the same time, intermittent reinforcement plays a powerful role in keeping the pursuer engaged. When attention is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, it creates a reward pattern that the brain struggles to resolve. This uncertainty triggers dopamine responses that are stronger than consistent reward. So even when the relationship feels unstable or unfulfilling, the unpredictability makes it harder to detach. You are no longer just responding to the person, you are responding to the pattern. This is why chasing often feels emotionally intense, but rarely leads to resolution. The system becomes self-sustaining. Their withdrawal triggers your pursuit, and your pursuit triggers their withdrawal. Each side unintentionally reinforces the other's behavior. Over time, this creates distance instead of closeness, confusion instead of clarity. In healthy relational dynamics, connection is built through mutual regulation, not escalation. When one person pulls back, the stabilizing response is not increased pursuit but grounded presence. Without that stability, the relationship shifts into asymmetry. One person overinvests while the other disengages. And asymmetry always produces strain. The paradox is that the harder you try to fix disconnection through effort alone, the more the nervous system on the other side interprets that effort as imbalance. And imbalance is not experienced as safety. It is experienced as something to escape from. This is why chasing creates psychological resistance. It is not about lack of value or lack of attraction alone. It is about the way the human nervous system processes intensity, pressure, and autonomy. When pursuit overrides emotional space, the natural response is withdrawal, even when there is underlying interest. Understanding this pattern is not about blaming either side. It is about recognizing the mechanics of emotional interaction. Because once you see the mechanism clearly, you can stop participating in the loop that feeds it. Avoidant attachment is often misunderstood as a lack of interest, emotional coldness, or even indifference. But at its core, it is not about absence of feeling. It is about discomfort with emotional closeness when that closeness begins to feel too intense, too fast, or too consuming. The key distinction is important because it changes how the behavior should be interpreted. Many people assume that if someone pulls away, it means they do not care. In reality, the emotional system behind avoidant behavior is far more complex. Individuals with avoidant attachment can experience attraction, curiosity, and even deep emotional connection. However, when intimacy increases beyond their internal threshold of comfort, their nervous system begins to register closeness as a form of pressure rather than safety. This is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic regulation response designed to protect their sense of independence and emotional control. The moment emotional dependency or expectation is perceived, the system activates distancing behaviors. This distancing does not always look dramatic. It can appear as delayed responses, reduced emotional expression, shifting focus away from the relationship, or becoming suddenly busy or unavailable. From the outside, it may seem like disinterest, but internally, it is often a recalibration process, an attempt to restore emotional equilibrium after feeling overwhelmed by closeness. What makes this dynamic confusing is that avoidant individuals often do not consistently reject connection. Instead, they oscillate between engagement and withdrawal. When the emotional intensity decreases, they may return, reconnect, and show warmth again. This cycle reinforces misunderstanding in the other person, who interprets reconnection as proof of stability. But the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Closeness triggers discomfort, and discomfort triggers distance. It is also important to understand that avoidant attachment is typically shaped by early relational experiences. When emotional expression was not consistently met with safety, responsiveness, or predictability, the individual learns to self-regulate by relying less on others. Over time, independence becomes not just a preference but a protective strategy. Emotional closeness, while desired on some level, becomes associated with loss of control, obligation, or vulnerability. Because of this, avoidant behavior is not simply about avoiding people, it is about managing internal emotional activation. When someone becomes too emotionally available, too expressive, or too dependent, it can unintentionally activate the other person's protective mechanism, anisms. The result is withdrawal, not necessarily because the connection is unwanted, but because it is experienced as overwhelming. This is where many relational misunderstandings occur. The more one person pursues clarity, reassurance, or deeper intimacy, the more the avoidance system may perceive pressure. And the more pressure is perceived, the stronger the need for space becomes. This creates a cycle where both individuals are reacting to each other's nervous system responses rather than to intentional decisions. However, it is equally important to avoid overgeneralizing avoidant attachment as something fixed or unchangeable. People with this pattern are capable of meaningful connection when they feel emotionally safe, not pressured, and not engulfed. Safety in this context means having space to regulate without feeling demanded, controlled, or emotionally flooded. So the real insight is this. Avoidant attachment is not a rejection of connection itself. It is a sensitivity to how connection is experienced. When closeness feels grounded and paced, it can be tolerated and even valued. When it feels intense or consuming, the system activates distance as a form of self-protection. Understanding this distinction allows for clearer interpretation of behavior. It shifts the focus away from "they don't care" toward "they regulate closeness differently." And once you recognize that difference, you begin to see that the dynamic is not simply about interest or disinterest, but about emotional capacity, nervous system response, and perceived safety within connection. Your nervous system is not just observing your relationships, it is adapting to them in real time. When you consistently overinvest in someone who is inconsistent, your internal system begins to treat anxiety not as a warning signal, but as a normal state of functioning. This is one of the most subtle but powerful shifts that can happen in emotional dynamics, because it doesn't feel like something is chaotic, at first. It feels like you are simply trying harder or caring more, while in reality your baseline emotional regulation is being altered. When someone is inconsistent, sometimes present, sometimes distant, sometimes responsive, and sometimes unavailable, it creates unpredictability. The human nervous system is designed to detect patterns and adjust expectations accordingly. In stable environments, it learns calm. In unstable environments, it learns alertness. So when you repeatedly engage with emotional inconsistency, your system begins to anticipate uncertainty as the default. Over time, this anticipation becomes internalized. You stop reacting only to what is happening and start reacting to what might happen. You check your phone more often. You overanalyze tone, timing, and response gaps. You begin to interpret silence as meaning something, even when there is no clear evidence. This is not imagination, it is conditioning. Your nervous system is trying to reduce uncertainty by staying hyper-aware. The problem is that this heightened awareness feels like emotional investment, but it is actually a form of chronic activation. Your body remains in a subtle stress response because it never receives consistent signals of safety. One moment there is connection, the next moment there is distance. That fluctuation prevents your system from settling into regulation. Instead, it stays in a loop of readiness. What makes this even more impactful is that inconsistency creates intermittent reinforcement. This means that emotional rewards, attention, affection, validation arrive unpredictably. Psychologically, this pattern is extremely powerful because the brain releases stronger dopamine responses when rewards are uncertain. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You are not responding to stability, you are responding to the possibility of reward after uncertainty. As a result, your nervous system begins to associate anxiety with engagement. The feeling of not knowing becomes tied to emotional attachment. Calm, in contrast, can start to feel unfamiliar or even uninteresting because your system has not been conditioned to find safety in consistency. Instead, it has been trained to find stimulation in unpredictability. This is where overinvestment becomes dangerous on a psychological level. The more energy, attention, and emotional focus you place into someone inconsistent, the more your internal baseline shifts toward emotional instability. You start to tolerate levels of uncertainty that you would normally recognize as unhealthy, not because your standards have changed consciously, but because your nervous system has adapted to survive the pattern. Eventually, what feels normal is no longer emotional peace, it is emotional fluctuation. The highs feel necessary to justify the lows, and the lows start to feel like something you must endure in order to reach the highs again. This creates a loop where anxiety is not just present, but integrated into your sense of connection. The most important realization is that this normalization process is reversible. When you step away from inconsistent reinforcement, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. At first, silence or stability may feel uncomfortable simply because it is unfamiliar. But over time, the baseline shifts again. You start to recognize calm not as boredom, but as regulation. You begin to experience consistency not as lack of excitement, but as emotional safety. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it shows that your emotional responses are not fixed. They are conditioned through repetition. And anything that has been conditioned can be reconditioned through awareness and behavioral change. Let them work because it interrupts a cycle in your brain that most people don't even realize they are trapped in. That cycle is the pursuit-reward loop. a behavioral pattern where your actions are driven by the anticipation of emotional payoff. W. When someone is inconsistent, distant, or selectively available, your nervous system starts trying to regain control of the uncertainty by increasing effort. You text more, explain more, wait more, and mentally rehearse outcomes. Each action is not random. It is driven by the expectation that if you just do a little more, you might finally get stability, clarity, or reassurance. This is where the loop forms. Pursuit becomes the behavior. Reward becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability becomes the hook. From a neurological standpoint, this loop is heavily influenced by dopamine. Dopamine is not simply the pleasure chemical as it is often simplified. It is primarily a motivation and anticipation chemical. It spikes not when you receive a reward, but when you expect one, especially when that reward is uncertain. So when someone gives inconsistent attention, sometimes warm, sometimes absent, your brain begins to amplify effort because it is trying to resolve the uncertainty. The problem, M, is that effort does not create consistency in another person. It only reinforces your own engagement in the cycle. The more you pursue, the more your brain associates their attention as something that must be earned through increased output. This is how emotional dependency subtly forms. Not through one dramatic moment, but through repeated reinforcement of chasing behavior. Let them disrupts this mechanism by removing your participation in the reward-seeking behavior. Instead of reacting, chasing, or trying to regulate the other person's inconsistency, you step out of the loop entirely. You allow their behavior to exist without trying to immediately fix, interpret, or influence it. This pause is not passive, it is neurologically significant. Because without your pursuit, the reinforcement cycle loses its second half. When you stop chasing, the brain no longer receives the pattern it has been conditioned to follow. Trigger, pursuit, reward expectation, temporary relief, and then LOSS again. Instead, the loop collapses because one of its key components, the behavioral response, is no longer active. This creates what can feel like withdrawal at first, because your nervous system has been trained to associate action with resolution. When action is removed, the system initially perceives discomfort. But that discomfort is actually the beginning of recalibration. Your brain is adjusting to the absence of intermittent reinforcement. It is learning that uncertainty does not need to be solved through pursuit. Over time, the intensity of the emotional pull decreases because the dopamine spikes associated with anticipation begin to normalize. Without constant engagement in the cycle, the reward pathway weakens its grip. This is why let them is not about indifference. It is about behavioral interruption. It is a conscious refusal to feed a loop that thrives on your emotional reactivity. You are not changing the other person, you are changing your participation in the dynamic. As this shift continues, something important happens internally. Your focus starts to return to yourself. Instead of monitoring someone else's availability or emotional signals, your attention is redirected toward your own stability. Energy that was previously used to manage uncertainty becomes available for structure, discipline, and self-regulation. And with time, the brain relearns a different association. Instead of linking connection with pursuit and anxiety, it begins to link emotional safety with consistency, clarity, and calm engagement. That is the real reset. Not controlling outcomes, but breaking the neurological pattern that made inconsistency feel compelling in the first place. Self-regulation and emotional control carry a different kind of weight in human interaction than pursuit behaviors do. Pursuit is often loud, visible, and driven by urgency. It seeks confirmation, reassurance, or response. But emotional control operates in a quieter way. It is not defined by what you do to get attention, but by what you choose not to do when your emotions are activated. And that difference changes how you are perceived, both internally and externally. When someone is emotionally dysregulated, their behavior tends to follow their feelings in real time. If they feel anxious, they reach out. If they feel uncertain, they seek answers immediately. If they feel ignored, they escalate their effort. This creates a pattern where emotional state directly drives action. While this may feel natural, it often leads to behaviors that are reactive rather than intentional. And reactive behavior, especially in relational context, tends to create instability rather than connection. Self-regulation interrupts that pattern. It introduces a pause between feeling and action. That pause is where control is reclaimed. Instead of immediately responding to emotional triggers, the individual observes them. Anxiety is felt, but not necessarily acted upon. Uncertainty is acknowledged, edged, but not immediately resolved through external validation. This creates a different behavioral signature, one that signals internal stability rather than dependency. From a psychological perspective, humans are highly sensitive to emotional tone and regulation in others. People are not only attracted to appearance or verbal expression, they are also unconsciously tracking how stable someone is under emotional pressure. When someone consistently reacts, escalates, or pursues from a place of anxiety, the interaction begins to feel unbalanced. Even if interest is present, the emotional intensity can create pressure. In contrast, emotional control communicates something different. It communicates containment. It shows that internal states are not automatically outsourced to other people for resolution. This creates a sense of groundedness. And groundedness is often interpreted as safety, not because it is performative, but because it reduces unpredictability in the interaction. Pursuit behaviors, on the other hand, often carry an undercurrent of urgency. Even when they are well-intentioned, they can signal that the other person is responsible for regulating your emotional state. Repeated messaging, over-explaining, or trying to secure immediate responses can unintentionally shift the dynamic into one of imbalance. The interaction becomes less about mutual connection and more about emotional management. Self-regulation changes that dynamic. When someone can sit with discomfort without immediately acting on it, it creates space. That space allows the other person to engage without feeling pressured or emotionally cornered. It also prevents the relationship from becoming driven by anxiety cycles, where one person's instability triggers the other's withdrawal. There is also a neurological dimension to this. Emotional regulation is linked to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and long-term thinking. When his system is active, behavior becomes more deliberate. Pursuit behaviors, especially when driven by anxiety, tend to be associated with more reactive limbic system activity, where survival-based emotions like fear of loss or rejection dominate. Over time, people tend to associate emotional control with reliability. Not perfection, not emotional suppression, but consistency in how someone responds under pressure. That consistency builds trust at a subconscious level. It signals that the person is not easily destabilized by external fluctuations. The irony is that pursuit is often motivated by the desire to increase connection, but it can reduce the very thing it is trying to create. Emotional control does the opposite. It does not chase connection, yet it often creates the conditions where connection can form more naturally, without pressure or imbalance. This is why self-regulation is more attractive than pursuit behaviors. It is not about being distant or detached. It is about anchored. And in human relationships, anchoring is what allows interaction to feel safe, stable, and sustainable over time. Leveling up is often misunderstood as simply improving appearance, increasing status, or becoming more successful in external terms. But at its core, it is a psychological shift in where your attention and emotional energy are invested. It is the process of moving your focus away from attachment-based thinking where your emotional state is dependent on someone else's availability, validation, or behavior, and redirecting it toward identity, discipline, and long-term growth. This shift changes not only what you do, but how you exist in your daily life. Attachment-based focus keeps your attention externally anchored. You begin to measure your emotional stability through another person's responses. A message received can change your mood. A delay can create anxiety. A withdrawal can create overthinking loops. In this state, your internal world is constantly reacting to external signals. Your sense of self becomes unstable because it is being regulated by something you cannot control. Leveling up begins when that external anchor is weakened and replaced with internal structure. Identity becomes the foundation. Instead of asking, "How does this person feel about me?" the focus shifts to, "Who am I becoming regardless of who stays or leaves?" This is not a motivational phrase, it is a structural change in thinking. Identity becomes something you actively build through behavior, not something defined through relationship feedback. Discipline is what stabilizes that identity. Without discipline, identity remains conceptual. With discipline, it becomes embodied. Discipline is the repeated action of doing what aligns with your long-term self even when emotional states fluctuate. It is waking up and following through even when motivation is low. It is choosing consistency over emotional impulse. Over time, discipline reduces dependency on external emotions. Ional stimulation, because your sense of progress comes from your own behavior, not from relational validation. Growth is the outcome of this reorientation. When attention is no longer consumed by attachment dynamics, mental bandwidth becomes available for skill development, health, learning, and purpose-driven activity. Growth is not just achievement, it is expansion. It is the gradual increase of your capacity to handle complexity, uncertainty, and responsibility without losing emotional stability. When someone is stuck in attachment-driven thinking, a large portion of their cognitive energy is spent analyzing relational uncertainty. They are trying to decode signals, predict behavior, and manage emotional highs and lows. This creates internal fragmentation. Even when nothing is happening externally, the mind remains active in relational monitoring. This reduces clarity and limits forward movement in other areas of life. Redirecting that energy is where leveling up becomes real. It is not about suppressing attachment or pretending emotions do not exist. It is about changing the priority system. Instead of placing emotional dependency at the center of attention, you place development at the center. This reorganization changes how decisions are made. You begin to choose actions that strengthen your future self rather than stabilize your current emotional discomfort. As this shift continues, something important happens internally. Your emotional state becomes less reactive to external fluctuations. You are no longer pulled into every inconsistency or gap in attention. Instead, your focus is anchored in routines, goals, and self-directed progress. This creates a sense of stability that does not depend on other people's behavior. Ironically, this is often the point where attachment loses its intensity. When you are no longer over-invested in external validation, the emotional grip of inconsistency weakens. Not because you forced attachment, but because your attention is no longer feeding the cycle. Your identity becomes the reference point, your discipline becomes the structure, and your growth becomes the direction. Leveling up, then, is not about becoming someone else for someone's approval. It is about becoming someone who is no longer emotionally governed by approval at all.